Well, government is one of these very complicated terms in American tradition. When we talk about government, a couple things we have to do here. We have to try to get a clear picture of what we mean by this. First of all, government in the United States is divided up in various ways. First, we have the aspect of federalism. The government in the United States is divided up into different levels of government. That's what we mean by a federal government. Another word for federal government is a decentralized government. Government is not all centralized in one entity, but it's split up into different levels. First, we have the federal level of the United States government up in Washington, House of Representatives, the Senate, the President, the U.S. Supreme Court, and so forth. And then we have the state governments. There are 50 state governments, each of which is established by its own state constitution. And these state governments have their own level of authority and sovereignty. And within the states, government, the levels are further broken down into county, city, township, parish, village, and so forth, all kinds of lower levels of government within the states. So government is divided up into federal government and the state governments. Power is dispersed. The opposite of a federal government or a decentralized government is what's called a unitary or centralized government. What that would look like, it would be, let's imagine that we get rid of all the 50 state governments and all the local governments and so forth, and the only government we have is the U.S. government up in Washington. That would be a centralized or unitary government. It's the exact opposite of our constitutional structure. France has a relatively centralized or unitary government and so forth. But anyway, so that's the federal dimension. So government is broken up into different levels. But within the levels, government is further broken up into different branches. And this has to do with what we call separation of powers. In our constitutional structure, the government at both levels, federal and state, is further, the power is further dispersed or divided by breaking up the different functions of government into different branches. The legislative branch obviously is responsible for declaring what the law is. The executive branch is responsible for enforcing the law made by the independent legislative body. And the judicial branch is called upon to adjudicate cases of conflict, also a separate independent branch. And so the three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, are broken up in both the federal levels, the U.S. government, and within the state governments. So we have a federal legislative branch, the House of Representatives and Senate, a federal executive branch, the presidency, federal judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and lower federal courts. And within the states, the same thing. We have the state legislative branch, which in case of Florida is up in Tallahassee, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We have a state executive branch. The counterpart of the president at the state level is the governor of the state. And we have a state judicial branch, the state courts that adjudicate Florida law and so forth. So the point is the government is a very complex entity in American society. And pick any governmental institution you want. Let's take the IRS. Well, you can identify what level it belongs to and what branch. So in the case of the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, that of course is at the federal level. It's a U.S. government agency. And what branch is the IRS? Legislative, executive, judicial? Well, actually it's executive. The tax laws are made by the legislative branch, but then the executive is charged with the obligation to execute or enforce those laws, and so they set up these various bureaucracies that are intended to execute the law made by the legislative branch. Or let's say, the DMV. DMV, is that, what level is that? Federal level or state level? Well, obviously it's state level because the different states have different laws governing how people acquire a driver's license. Florida has different laws than Georgia, than New York, than Nevada, and so forth. So the state, so the DMV that you go to, that's a state level governmental agency. And what branch is it? Well, in the case of the DMV, that's also part of the executive branch. The legislature makes the laws governing what you have to do to get a license, and then the executive has to carry that out by setting up a bureaucratic office to execute the law made by the legislative branch. Okay, So the point I'm trying to make to you is that government is a very complex entity with both levels and branches in American society. But what unites all of these governmental entities at whatever level, whatever branch, they too, like their counterparts in the private sector, the governmental or public sector, each of those governmental institutions also possesses two attributes that unite them into one class. First, let's start with, we saw that the moral attribute in civil society is the fact that they're all voluntary or free. Is that the case for governmental institutions? Are they voluntary? The answer is no. They're not voluntary because every governmental institution is established by law. And already we've seen what is the characteristic of a law. It's not a suggestion. It is backed by a coercive sanction. Government is the organized agency of coercive force. That's what it is. That's what makes it different from every other social institution in society. That we're not, no other institution is permitted to use coercive force against people. Government is within the limits of the Constitution. And if you think that's not the case, next time you're driving up 95 and you accidentally find yourself going over the speed limit and the policeman stops you and calls you over, getting ready to ticket you, and you say, you know, officer, thank you very much for your concern, but I choose not to participate in this activity. I don't think that's a good thing because it's not voluntary, right? Whether you want to or not, you are participating in the laws that govern our traffic flow. Okay, all right, so government is involuntary, and that's another word for coercive, and they all are. Post office, no one's allowed by law to create an organization that competes with the post office in sending first-class mail, for example. It's against the law. All right, so what else do these governmental institutions have in common, beside the fact that they are involuntary? The second question is, again, who pays for them? Who pays for the expenses of all these governmental institutions? Not the people who choose to participate in them. Maybe you don't participate in hardly any of them, but nevertheless, who pays for them? It is taxpayers who pay for them, and not as in the private sector, by individuals who voluntarily choose to participate in them. Taxes are not voluntary. We've already seen that taxes are paid in accordance with, there's a certain tax code that has legal penalties for people who do not pay their taxes, and most people pay their taxes because if they don't, they're going to face serious consequences. It is a coerced act. We already addressed that in Chapter 1. So all government activities are paid for by coercive taxation. Whether you approve of the activity or not, whether you want to utilize it or participate in any governmental service or activity, it doesn't matter. If you are a taxpayer, you will pay for it. A lot of parents, for example, have to pay, a lot of people have to pay property taxes, which often go to support the schools in their local area, even if they don't have children in those schools, just as one small example. And so the two attributes that unite all governmental institutions at whatever level and whatever branch are that they are involuntary, that is, backed by a coercive sanction, and two, they are paid for by taxation, by coercive taxation rather than by voluntary contributions of participants. This is what we call the public or governmental sector. And in a free society, we have a governmental sector. We've seen that government is essential for the protection of our rights and so forth. But it's a small segment of society. Whereas in a communist society, see, there's an inverse relationship between the public sector and the private sector. The larger the private sector, necessarily the smaller the public sector must be, and vice versa. The larger the public sector, the smaller the free or voluntary sector must be. That's just a matter of logic. There's no escaping that. And you can see then, you can diagram various kinds of political systems in terms of this framework. In a pure communist society, government owns everything, controls everything, and so it completely eliminates the private sector or civil society. Nothing is voluntary. Everything is under the control of the government. In traditional American society, I mean, you know, these are just rough generalizations, but you might say 3/4 of the society is in the free or private sector, and then we have a government that maybe is in 1/4 of that. And so you can have various divisions here. And the society is more or less free depending upon the size of the relative size of the public and private sectors. All right? So that's a good way to think about the issue of the proper role of government in society. In our tradition, we believe that historically that government is limited to certain very important and crucial activities, such as related to protecting the rights of the individual citizens. And so there is a legitimate governmental sector where government may use coercive force, as we've seen, to enforce laws that protect the rights of individual citizens. But we've conceived that, and certainly under the classical liberal tradition, as being a limited government. That's what we mean by it. However, over the course of the 20th century, government in the United States has consistently grown. Some scholars estimate if you add together all this spending of governments at federal, state, and local levels, it's approaching something between 35 and 40% of American GDP. That means that the governmental sector has grown to almost 40% of the entire GDP of the whole society. 100% is pure communism. So you can see there has been a consistent pattern over the 20th century for government to get larger and larger and larger, which means a growth of the public sector and a subsequent reduction of the free or voluntary sector. So that's just to give you a schematic idea of the inverse relationship here between public and private sector, between the voluntary and coercive sector, that relates to this liberal question of what is the proper role of government in society. So, chapter 4 of your book discusses all of this in greater detail should you have any questions. But we'll close for now, and thank you. Bye.